Thank you so much to everyone for coming. David and I are thrilled to continue a conversation that we've been having together and with lots of you, now with Christine. So it is really David and my distinct and huge pleasure to introduce Dr. Christine Checinska. Yes, Senior Curator of African Diaspora, Textiles and Fashion at the V&A, as well as an artist and a fashion designer in her own right. I cannot stress this enough. Her show is a landmark exhibition. It celebrates the growing influence of creatives from across the continent, and after 2 years in the making, it's the most extensive exhibition of African fashion to date, which obviously means it's one of the largest of its kind staged in the UK. I mean, quite an incredible thing that she's done, so go, go, go. And I think the exhibition, and you can fact check me here, features 45 designers from how many countries?
It's about 22.
22 countries. And more than 250 objects, right? Mm-hmm. And so you've got work by local dressmakers, you've got bark cloth, you've got amazing things that have been pulled out of the V&A's collection, as well as items which have been donated from personal archives, including an amazing selection of photography, and also a few works by Sanlé, Sory and Rachidi, Bissiriou, which were borrowed from David and I. And just to put a pin in this, what I found so refreshing was that Christine put out a public call for work. So not just finding work or photographs that were in galleries and sort of had that stamp of approval, but from families, home movies, and specifically around the liberation and independence years. And I think that is again, makes this show just exceptional and extraordinary and so different. And really everything about the exhibition, Africa Fashion, is tied up in this idea of self-representation, and not about the West looking in on Africa as other. So that's my fangirl bit done.
Thank you.
And I'll have a few questions. How do you, when you set out to do an exhibition of this scale, where do you start?
You just have to start. You take that first step. But I think for me, it was really important right at the very beginning. And I still have my original pin board. And so on that original pin board were things like agency, abundance rather than lack, the fact that you cannot separate fashion, music, movement, photography and film. I feel that all of those are one art form in a sense when we think about the continent. So those were the basic principles, and also this idea that we were going to centre Africa, that we were almost going to metaphorically plant our feet on the continent and look at the rest of the world from that standpoint. And I feel that has given the exhibition a particular quality and a particular character. We wanted to give our platform at the V&A, we wanted to almost pass the mic, actually, is how I might describe it. This idea of wanting as many different voices and perspectives from the continent to be present in all aspects of the exhibition.
And with a fashion show at the V&A, there's normally this much photography. How did you see the role of photography playing out in the show?
Well, for me, there was no question. So from the beginning, again on that original pin board again, photography was always there. I've really felt it was important. If the story that we're telling is one of agency and self-representation, how can you not have photography? How can you not have film? And it is quite unusual to have this amount of photography and film within the exhibition. So for example, it's split across 2 floors, and on the ground floor, no one has ever clad we have these sort of 1960s cases that are immovable. But for Africa Fashion, we just covered those with plywood and turn them into walls so we could put more photography in, you know. So photography was central right from the beginning to show self-fashioning, to show self-representation, to help us to tell that story.
Now, I don't mind admitting that our blue wall was completely inspired by when you all go to the V&A. You will see that the photography that Christine has put up is on a beautiful blue wall. And we saw the show and thought, that's a good move. So we did it too.
Carrie saw the show, thought, blue wall.
True. Why the blue wall though?
Well, the colours across the exhibition are all drawn from different landscapes across the continent. So when you go into the exhibition, there's that lovely kind of almost pale terracottas and ambers that reference a Moroccan Medina, and it's all hand painted, hand finished. There had to be indigo walls. Yes, it references the ocean, but it also references the importance of indigo in terms of many African spiritualities and philosophies, and this idea of coolness, the idea of itutu, that philosophy of gracefulness. It's all rooted in that colour of indigo. So to get the right indigo was really important to me. And I remember, it was like a comedy. I was literally running around the building, looking at the different blues, looking at adire, wanting to kind of represent the colour of indigo adire on a wall. And I had about 1,000 colour charts. On CCTV, it must have looked hilarious because I was literally running around going, no, that's the wrong blue. It needs to be more like this. Let me have a look at this fabric, And so indigo is really important. And it's the photography section downstairs and the contemporary photography upstairs, all mounted on indigo walls for that reason. It's spiritual. It connects to the many philosophies. It connects to this idea of cool pose, and that was really important.
What, can we back up for half a beat? How did you end up at the V&A?
Do you know, I often ask myself.
Well, because you were a designer, right?
I was designing. I've been a fashion designer it's over 35 years, and I can't believe it. But so I was designing right up until joining the museum. And I ended up there because several of my friends, literally 4 or 5 friends, saw the advertisement for a curator at the V&A. I didn't see it. And after the 4th or 5th person sent me the advertisement via email, and then someone put it on my Facebook page, I thought, well, maybe, and all my friends were going, oh yes, you should totally apply. I thought, well, maybe I should apply. But it was a big decision because, I thought, well, I've got a successful career as a designer. I'm doing all my freelance art stuff, and I felt quite successful and free as a bird kind of thing. But also thinking, oh yes, in 5 years' time I'll retire, so I could just keep designing. And so then, bam, when I was offered the job, I thought, well, what do I do? What do I do? And I'm so glad it felt like a leap to go into the museum world. But I feel I've found my niche. It's only taken 35 years, right? But I feel that I've found my niche because with Africa Fashion, I could bring all of those different strands together. I could bring my love of photography into this show. I'm an enthusiast rather than an expert. I could bring the textiles. I could bring my writing. All of those different strands that I was doing anyway somehow funnel into Africa Fashion. So, it was a real turning point moment to be offered the job, and I deliberated, and I'm so glad that I took what felt like a leap into the museum world.
And was Africa Fashion your first sort of baby, your first project?
It's my first project at the V&A. And so I'm back to thinking maybe I should retire, because how do you top it? What do I do next? I'm not quite sure. People keep asking me. But no, it was like manna from heaven to have this topic as my first project at the V&A. It's just been extraordinary.
So I almost don't. That's such a happy story and a hopeful story, right? It means I might still find my niche here. What in our really initial discussions. And we saw, I think we saw a press release, thanks to David's amazing partner, Navaz, who's also here. We saw the press release announcing the show. And we had Tete up at the time, and we said, hey, we should just let's call them. And actually, I wrote to Tristram directly, who in his infinite wisdom just said, here's Christine. And in that very first conversation, you said to us, self-representation. And it was, this is the height of lockdown still, we were pandemic mode, and so it was Zoom. And that impressed on me a huge amount, and I'm getting out a prop that I'm going to pass around. Because David and I had been having conversations about this book in particular, against the images in Tete-a-Tete, and against Rachidi Bissiriou in particular, because this book came out, or the works in this book came out in Vogue a year before these images were shot. And this is Irving Penn, everybody, and I will pass it if everyone can look at it, just those that don't know it. But they tell two completely different stories. One is of otherness and primitivism, whereas Bissiriou's portraits are, for me, and I think for everyone that sees them, they're this celebration of self, and records of a life as it was. And what I mean by that is there's particularly a few portraits of women in this room now, that they are so intact as themselves. It's as if you're looking into a mirror while they're looking into the mirror. They're almost self-portraits. And I would beg you all after to go up and look at the women, because they're not objectified, they're not sexualized, they are not other, they are just themselves. And I'm not saying that as elegantly as I would like, but the contrast of those to Penn and Dahomey, this is not to sort of point a finger at Penn and say, you terrible human, how could you possibly have done that? But more to look at them side by side and tell the story about these two different things that we're now able to see that we didn't see 30 years ago. And my question is that I'm sort of interested in how you you negotiate the lack of accurate representation in this show without being, I did a reel on Instagram where I was like, I'm so mad, right? I'm mad about it, but you seem to do it in this really celebratory way.
Well, I think it's interesting because when, in those early lockdown days when I was thinking about the show, I had actually forgotten about the Irving Penn images, even though I've sort of lived with Irving Penn because of his fashion photography for decades. I'd forgotten about that series of work. But there were other photographs that I was looking at, which I don't think I've shared with you, and there were more of that kind of anthropological gaze. And so I had sort of images of that kind of anthropological European gaze on black women, black and African women, and up on my pinboard. And I've really felt there was no way that I could include that in the show, because this show begins and ends with Africa and African perspectives, and the gaze is African. There's a moment and I think it is in the Capturing Chains of Photography section, where the storytelling is told in the first person. And it's quite interesting because some people really notice the fact that the story is told in the first person, and they realise that actually it's about us, it's about the black and African us. When I say we could show ourselves as we always knew we could be, always knew we were, as individuals with style, with intellect, with modernity, with cosmopolitanism. But some people read that text and they find it confusing. And I think it's because people are not used to reading a gallery text or any text in a book or magazine where the first person begins with a black and African first person. And so that, for me, is the kind of underlying power of what we've done throughout the show. And it's how I've managed to, by embedding or starting the show in that independence era, when you go into the show, that's the first section. You walk through something that tells you of our colonial past, that tells you about 1960 being the year of Africa, where I think it's 17 countries gained their independence. And then you move forward from there. So you don't get ensnared by those, the anthropological gaze. You don't get ensnared by a white European gaze. You don't engage with it. And we tell people, we're not engaging with it. And I think that was what was so powerful when I first came and saw the Bissiriou shots, because I didn't know of his work. And I feel that that's what you see. You were saying, well, they're almost like self-portraits. You get a sense of someone having the picture taken for themselves in the way that they want to be seen. And there's such a wonderful kind of contemporary elegance about them that really felt unexpected when I saw them for the first time. So they had to be in the show. The dilemma was which ones, plural, but they had to be in the show because they absolutely speak to the ethos of the show before you even get on to the fashion and the composition of the images. The ethos of the show, I think, breathes through those photographs.
And what would be the one thing that you want audiences of the exhibition to take away? That one ethos. Yeah,
I want people to see what I would describe as the genius of African creativity. I want people to go away hungry for more, but to be respectful when they engage with African creativity across all of the genres, whether it's art, whether it's music, whether it's fashion, because for me there is no separation.
Like that. And I'm going to put you on the spot, and then I'm going to awkwardly hand the mic over to David, which I've been worrying about since I started. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot. But given the reevaluation of museum collections, what is the V&A doing to right the balance in terms of collecting in particular, and shows like this going forward?
Yes. I mean, Africa Fashion really should be seen as the start of something. And what's really exciting is the museum's commitment to kind of consciously celebrating African creativity and to extend our holdings to include African creativity across different media, across different genre. So, for example, my role is a permanent role now.
So you can't retire?
I can't retire, not yet. Not quite. I've got a few years to go. But what's lovely is during the course of developing the show, my role was changed to become a permanent role rather than a fixed term. And I think that shows some commitment. We also have 2 additional Africa-focused curators. Actually, it's 3 additional Africa-focused curators now. So we have Emma Foucault, the jeweller, has just joined us as a jewellery curator, which is brilliant. I don't know if people know her work, but that's really, really exciting. We also have Jacqueline Spuringer, who's the newish now theatre and performance curator with a specialism in music. And we have Donata Minna, who's an assistant curator, and she sits within art, architecture, painting and digital department. So we're sort of dotted around. I almost feel that we're like yeast in bread, We're dotted around in different departments, but I feel we can really make a change. But there's an absolute commitment to extending the holdings. And Good. I think that that's really important.
And Africa Fashion is staying out in the world. So we can't talk about it, right?
Well, we can't talk about it in detail, but it will be going on tour. It will go on an international tour and be out in the world until 2026, which is brilliant. It's brilliant for everyone in the show, I think.
Absolutely. Right, on that.
We are. So I'm David Hill, in case anybody in the room hasn't met me before. Thanks again, Christine, for coming down for this.
It's my pleasure. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you about Bissiriou, because, as I say, I fell in love with the work when I first saw it. And so I'd love to ask you, maybe, could you start by sharing a little bit about when you first encountered the work?
Well, it really goes back to 2016, not for Bissiriou, but for Sanlé Sory. And I am a keen record buyer. I buy a lot of records.
That's an understatement, isn't it?
So, jazz, soul, Latin, also African. And there was a compilation that came out on an American record label, and the box set of this had a book that was with it. And in that book, it had Sanlé Sory photographs, first time I'd ever seen them. And the book was, and the compilation was put together by Florent Mazzolini, who's a French musicologist, journalist, writer. So I bought this the day it was released, of course, and contacted him the same day. And by the end of the day, we were then representing the artist.
Wow.
Prior to that, he'd had a show at the French Institute in Bobadilla-Lasso in Burkina Faso. And then the first gallery show was here. So that was how the African photography journey started for me, really. I mean, prior to that, I was aware of Malik Sidibe, I was aware of Sadie Cater, loved the work, but this was an opportunity to actually get involved and show some.
But what was it about Sory that drew you in? Because that's an immediate reaction. So why? What was it about him?
Very warm, celebratory, very proud. It was very different in feel to Malik Sidibe, I thought. And it seems to have been celebrated for that by many people since. I mean, he's gone on to get representation in Fifth Avenue Gallery, first African photographer to get an American Museum show, Art Institute Chicago, represented in Paris now, Amsterdam, been included in shows in Norway, Spain. So yeah.
Amazing. And I'm always struck by the way that the designers, the fashion designers, are really inspired by his work as well. I'm thinking about people like Grace Wells Bonner, whose collection was based on some of his photography. And so how would you respond to that? How might he respond to that?
Well, he worked with Grace on that. I mean, he actually shot some of her clothes for ID magazine.
Fantastic.
About 3 or 4 issues ago, something like that.
Wow.
So, I mean, she called her collection Volta Jazz. He took the photographs for a Volta Jazz band that was run by his cousin, I think. And that's how that sort of all came together. So she went with Volta Jazz as a title. Some of his imagery, she'd licensed 2 images. And then he shot the contemporary collection. So
that's brilliant. But his work is quite different from Bissiriou. So I really want to ask
very
you about
different.
Bissiriou.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think Sanlé Sory's work has similarities with other photographers from the region. He just does it better than most, and more consistently as well. I mean, I've been through, I don't know, tens of thousands of Sanlé Sory negatives, and the strike rate is just extraordinary. You see good shots from other people, but not to the same frequency you do with Sanlé Sory. The consistency of quality across his negatives. I mean, one thing I should say on that as well is to be borne in mind is that film stock was a precious commodity in West Africa. So it's not like over here where someone might have run off 2 or 3 rolls of film on a sitter. Over there it's 1 frame, 2, occasionally 3. So he had to get it right, and he had his formula and he knew his lighting position, he knew where they would stand. It was all very down pat. Obviously there'd be a degree of variance in there as well, but that's how it was kind of done. I mean, it was pretty much a line, and of course people were going into character and acting up, and it was
there's a real sort of playfulness, isn't there? And remember, they're young people, and it's about sort of playing and showing off with the props, with the fashions, with the backdrops.
Oh, totally. But this was also within the confines of him having set his lights in a particular way, so he was able to capture that moment within 1 or 2 frames.
Amazing. Amazing.
Very different to over here. But the difference with Bissiriou is, I think, it's just a very, very different aesthetic. It's different than anything else I've seen. It's very personal. The connection between the subject and the photographer, and of course, we are the photographer because we're in the same position that he was in the lens. We get that. You can see the closeness in the eyes. I mean, there's no barrier there. There's no guardedness. There's no wariness, unlike the pen shots that we saw earlier.
And you were speaking to me about the lighting, because there is this wonderful kind of softness around the images. Was there a particular formula for lighting these shots, do you think?
Well, I mean, he had a photo studio, and there are some studio shots, but most of the work in this show is shot outdoors in natural light, but indirect natural light, so it's quite soft. Most people from the region at the time were shooting under twin spotlights in the studio, and they're great images, like the Sanlé Sory ones up here, for example. But it's a different aesthetic. These, because they're very softly lit, they feel quite contemporary, quite timeless in a way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And the other thing that's quite interesting with these is you'll see all the shots on the walls, they're all square format. And that's because the camera that Bissiriou used was a twin lens. It was a Japanese version of a Rolleiflex that shot at waist level. You look through the top lens, you shoot through the bottom lens. And it produced a square image, 6 by 6 centimetres. But the paper type, that was the cheap paper he could use, was rectangular. So all of the shots he produced back in the day were cropped. So that's how a vintage print looked. They were never printed exhibition size. This is the first time they've been printed like this. So these are all pretty much 5.5 by 3.5 inches, but cropped to rectangular. So when we were going through the process of putting this show together, we took the Curator decision to keep everything full frame. So you can see how Bissiriou instinctively composed images in the viewfinder. You can see his eye. Because if it's cropped tightly, you lose a lot of that. And I think the images are much richer for it. They're able to breathe on the paper, you know. And he might well have chosen to produce square images had it not been a cost aspect, you know.
Sure.
So.
Because what's really interesting in a lot of the shots, you get these beautiful kind of angles in the background, and even a slight angle in terms of the sitter as well. I'm trying to.
But it's quite unusual because you get that with lots of these head and shoulder shots.
Yes.
But head and shoulder shots back there in the day in that region, they were primarily for ID cards. Not all of them, but a lot of them were. So most people taking head and shoulder shots were quite rigid, quite formal, quite straight to camera. And you don't get that with Bissiriou's shots. There's often a drop shoulder, slightly twisted, as you say. And again, it helps it to feel very, very contemporary.
And very personal, you know. You do feel as though you have a relationship with the sitter because you, as you say, you're in the place of the photographer and you see the relationship he must have had with the sitters.
Well, I think also, you know, it's because he's really photographing people from his immediate community and people he would have seen on a daily basis. I mean, he would have been known to be the photographer in the community, like they would have known the postman, they would have known various different tradesmen.
It's interesting because as I speak, I feel the term sitter feels wrong because of that personal connection, and that's what we see in the shots.
Well, you know, in the Western world, you know, a good portrait photographer is somebody who can build a rapport very, very quickly with their sitter. He didn't need to do that. He already had the rapport. He saw people, you know, most days of the week for, you know, throughout the year. So, and I think that's one of the reasons why these barriers just aren't there. I mean, interestingly, we got the titles that you see under the works from Bissiriou about 3 weeks before this show opened. And I asked him for, we were able to get a PDF over to him, and I asked him for names, professions, this sort of thing. And some he could remember. Generally, he could remember more women than he could guys' names.
Funny enough.
But what's interesting is you see that this one here, we didn't know this until we got the names through, she's actually from a surrounding village. She's not in the direct community. And when you know that and you see her eyes, she's that little, her lips a little bit more pursed.
Yes.
There's a little bit more distance. They're not quite as open. I mean, she's not, you know, hugely wary, but doesn't have quite the same relationship with him as anybody else in the room. And we'd always wondered, and that came through because we now know which village she was from.
It's interesting. It's really interesting. But do you think that people view these images differently, knowing the profession or knowing a name? Does that sort of shift the way that we look at them?
I think it helps people, you know, Western European people, to see the similarities in the cultures rather than just the differences. And I think that's quite a key aspect. And we found that showing this work, people come and say, oh, but they were dressing just like us. Oh, hospital nurse. I get that. And it's, people could make those links. And hopefully it helps, you know.
So you see that kind of common humanity, don't you, I think? Actually, I'd love to know more about Bissiriou the man.
Well, we're yet to meet. I mean, I was supposed to go, I've been to Benin, but I've not met Bissiriou in person because we started on the Bissiriou journey. It was about 4 years ago. And this also came through a music connection. Because we were known for showing Sanlé Sory's work first, I got offered a lot of West African photography. And some of it was good, but it wasn't as good as Sanlé Sory. It was a kind of, you know, a similar sort of area, but we already had Sanlé Sory and he's amazing. But then I saw the Bissiriou work and it was very different, so I went for that. But the guy who found Rachidi Bissiriou's work, like Florent, different Frenchman, record dealer. These are the guys who are out there digging around in the villages, finding African records, rare records that they can bring back and they can sell and this sort of thing. There's a guy who's called Nuno, who's down in Marseille, and he offered me this work. Now, Nuno knows me because I bought records from him in the past, and that's how it came to me. And I saw this, and again, I was on a plane very, very quickly to Marseille, and that was a 4-year journey. But the thing to be borne in mind is the negatives are never stored with any great thought for the future. So they've got problems with scratches, emulsion on the negative missing, the part that holds the information.
And a lot of the negatives were destroyed, right?
Lots of them were burnt as well, but I mean, the ones that survived, they all have problems. So they needed to be scanned to the highest resolution, meticulously restored. This is Alex Schneiderman and at the back, who's responsible for the restoration. Flow photographic. And then they were all balanced, and we were very mindful when balancing these to try to strike what we felt was had exhibition prints existed in the 1970s or 80s, we hoped that this is what they might have looked like. So we didn't want them to feel slightly pumped up like a contemporary print, almost like these were lost exhibition prints. That was where we were trying to go with this.
But tell me a bit more about his influences and his aesthetic, because it is so different. And we've spoken a bit about the connection to music, and Volta Jazz with Sory, but visually these compositions, and what was his, was he looking at when he was working? Who might have been his inspiration?
My view with this is, he as I say, he opened his studio in '68. He studied for a year beforehand, and that would have, as I said earlier, been predominantly the technical aspect of things, not stylistic, not aesthetic. I mean, I studied photography for 3 years, and most of that was the technical aspect. So the thing to be borne in mind is there were very few photo books in the UK in the late 60s, let alone in West Africa. He was 120 kilometres inland, that's where K2 is. It's 120 kilometres up from, say, Porto Novo, Cotonou, on the Nigerian side. So it's not like it was a port town, sailors bringing copies of Paris Match, this kind of thing. It wouldn't have been happening. I think he might have had access to French Hollywood magazines, maybe French movie mags with Alain Delon and people like this, but it would have been American record sleeves, rhythm and blues, soul, jazz, Latin, this sort of thing. And you see people holding lots of record sleeves in, well, particularly Sanlé Sory shots, Rachidi shots, things like this. They're not necessarily holding them in the Bissiriou shots, but I'm pretty sure that would have certainly been a big influence on his aesthetic.
And also the people in the shots, right? Because if you're surrounded by album covers and those kinds of aesthetics, you would adopt a certain way of being in front of the camera. We do that today, don't we? We have a sort of a pose almost, and I think, you wonder how much is him and how much is the person in the photograph thinking, well, that's me looking a bit cooler in the way that these guys look in the album covers.
I think if he could photograph people and make them look a little bit like that, he would have been quite popular as a photographer. So,
Yes.
And we've seen it with Sanlé Sory shots. I mean, there's one that we put in a short clip, little film, which is on the website, and it's a guy who's dressed almost exactly like Sly Stone on a particular album sleeve, and you look at the two. I mean, it's clear that's where it's come from. So there was a lot of that feeding into it, I'm sure.
It's interesting because the fashions that you see, just thinking about the way that people are clothed, it's a real mixture, and I think that again is the real joy about these shots for me as someone interested in fashion. So you get the sense it's not necessarily the playful, whimsical dressing up. It's not necessarily Sunday best. It's people as they are, which again I think feels very different.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, the people that Bissiriou photographed are wearing their own clothes. They haven't gone into a dressing up box. Some of them are their everyday clothes. Some of them are special occasion clothes. There's a grandmother up here. She's got a wedding outfit on.
Yes.
But what he was doing was positioning people. He would direct them a bit like a movie director. There's the one of the 5 Friends, which you have in your show.
Yes.
And he went and he positioned those people to get that shot. That's what he speaks about that in an interview in the Hot Shoe magazine, which I gave you earlier.
Would we like to show the Hot Shoe magazine?
We could do that.
I think so. It's a lovely segue.
So
Hot Shoe
this is out at the moment. Hot Shoe comes out a couple of times a year, magazine, and it's always on a particular theme or a photographer. This one's a West African portrait. 10 photographers in it, and they kindly asked me to be the contributing editor, so I chose those. But it's got interviews with Bissiriou, interviews with Sanlé Sory, interview with Leonce Raffaele Borgello as well. And they've done a lovely job with it, so yeah.
You've done a lovely job with it.
Well, I didn't produce it. Anyway, so we've got some of those up here if anyone would like one. So.
And so if you were to sum up the appeal of Bissiriou, how would you sum him up, his work, his practice?
Just seems to connect with everybody. With people who have either come here specifically as a sort of destination or people walking in off the street. Everybody is connected with this work. There hasn't been anybody who's been even indifferent. And I think that's largely because it is so personal and the connect between the people he's photographing, not the sitters, and the photographer is so strong, you know.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Thank you very much.